Good morning to those of you joining the webinar. It's not quite 10 o'clock, so I will wait till 10 o'clock to start properly. So I'm just going to give everybody a chance to log on. Just so you're not entirely quiet, I'm just giving people a chance to log on. It's just coming up to 10 o'clock by my clock. I'll make a prompt start at 10 o'clock, hopefully. So good morning, everybody. My name is Susie Calder, and I'm your webinar host today. Thank you so much for joining me. Welcome to this Spark Somerset webinar. Please do say hello in the chat so I know you can hear me and see my screen. I will be sending the slide and a handout by email after the webinar today, so do rest assured that you'll have access to the slides and one handout, I think it is. Fantastic, starting to see some hellos. Fantastic, brilliant. So I'm sure that many of you have used Zoom before, but just in case, at the bottom of your screen, hopefully, there's some Zoom controls. You are muted and your cameras are off. You should be able to see my screen. You should be able to see a raised hand feature. So when I ask some questions, I might ask you to raise some hands. There will be one poll. You should be able to see the poll straight away once I launch it. You might need to make the Zoom webinar full screen to see it. And do feel free to ask any questions as we go along in the chat box, and there will be a chance for questions at the end as well. I'll try and keep up with any questions that pop up though. Okay, so let's make some progress, hopefully. So today's webinar is a short overview of how to look after people's data when running community activities for vulnerable people with using volunteers. We're going to cover the basics of complying with the law, how to share information safely, whether you should register with the Information Commissioner's Office, and like I said, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions about what you are and should be doing. I'm not a lawyer. There's some disclaimer stuff on screen. This is not legal advice. This is about practical stuff. And if you're from a parish council or a town council, the law applies differently. So it's really useful for you to know about that. And again, data protection is quite a broad subject, so I'm not going to be covering everything. This is going to be a little skip through some of the highlights, specifically aimed at if you've just formed a community group because of the COVID-19 stuff. So if you have just formed a community group, this may be the first time that you've had to think about data protection. The law is a set of sensible standards, believe it or not, that should help you handle people's information responsibility. And it means taking proper care of things like people's names and addresses, as well as more sensitive details about their health or religion. Importantly, data protection does not stop you from helping people in need. And today's webinar, like I said, is aimed at groups who are newish, but it will cover stuff that is relevant for most smaller groups. If you're from an organisation that's well established, large, or doing complicated things, then you might need a different level of information than this webinar is going to provide. But again, this half an hour is a useful introduction. So let's get on to the next thing. So acronym soup. There's a lot of terminology around data protection. Some of it can be quite confusing. You may have heard the terms ICO, GDPR, legitimate interest, consent, and stuff like that. And a lot of it can get a bit muddled. There is no doubt that data protection can get quite complex. However, if you're running activities in your community around the COVID-19 pandemic, then be assured that the data protection regulator understands that we're in a fairly novel situation and they are acting accordingly. The ICO, so that's the Information Commissioner's Office, they're the regulator for the UK in terms of data protection, and there's a link to their website there. In March, they released a blog that it was intended to clarify some of the basics of data protection and to give community groups particularly some clarity on how to apply the law in these unusual circumstances. And their advice is pretty useful, actually, and pretty succinct, which I know sounds a bit odd for a government agency, but it's true. So once we've gone through all of this stuff, I'm going to go through their advice in a bit more detail. The ICO are actually really happy to take calls, and they do have a phone number. If you go to their website is full of really good resources and advice, and it has a link to their phone number. Also, if you still need help, here at Spark, we can answer lots of questions about GDPR, about how you should apply data protection and stuff like that. So what is GDPR? You probably heard it a lot. It means General Data Protection Regulations. It is a piece of legislation from the EU, and we are still bound by it, despite the fact that we have now left the EU. It is enshrined in UK law as well. And in 2018, we enacted the Data Protection Act 2018. So there's some other provisions in the Data Protection Act that extend GDPR a little bit, but they're probably not relevant to you unless you work in MI5 and things like that. So yeah, so hopefully the only two acronyms I'm likely to use today are ICO and GDPR. Do pick me up if I use any others you're not familiar with. So what do we mean by data? Well, it means lots of different things, doesn't it, data? So let's do a little poll about what you think data is, both personal and sensitive data. So this poll, you might need to scroll down to see all the options. There's 2 questions, and pick as many answers as you think are true for both questions. Hopefully you can see that poll. Nobody's voted just yet, so if you can vote on the 2 questions. So personal information, is it absolutely any information about a person? Is it any information that can identify a person? Is it information only about living people? Is it deliberately complicated so no one can understand it? And then sensitive information. Is it information that can be considered private? Anything health related? Really hard to look after and should be avoided? Data concerning a person's sex life and sexual orientation. So I'm just going to give a little longer because not everybody's answered. Be great if you could answer. Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to just give like a couple more seconds. Brilliant. Everybody's answered. That's fantastic. Thank you ever so much. So I'm going to just go into these. Okay, so this is how we've answered. So oops, I've just passed on my slide without meaning to. There we go. Hopefully you can see the results of the poll. So personal information is, it is any information that can identify a person. This is one of the things that people get confused about GDPR. It isn't about just any information. So if you, you can't see you can't see the poll results because I have not shared them. There we go, we're sharing the results now. So any information that can identify an individual is personal information under GDPR, and it is only applicable to living people. Lots of people think it applies to the deceased as well, but it's not. It only applies to living people. And yes, it kind of does sometimes feel like it's deliberately complicated so no one can understand it, but I'm really glad to see that nobody's picked that as a result. So yeah, so personal information identifies an individual. Now the sensitive information, brilliant, you all thought that information is generally that can be considered private, and that's absolutely true. And it does, anything health related is sensitive information. Anything that concerns a person's sex life and sexual orientation, and anything revealing racial or ethnic origin is also sensitive information. So there's some other stuff that's generally considered special sensitive data, and so that's stuff that reveals your political opinions, your religious or philosophical beliefs, your trade union membership, any genetic data, biometric data, so that's things like fingerprints or even facial measurements, so biometric data on your passport, your photograph that's taken on your passport, they measure the distance between your eyes and some other key features, and so that's biometric data. Like I said, health, sex life and sexual orientation, those are the main categories of sensitive information. So perhaps in the text box, in the chat box, can anyone give any examples of personal data? Something that can identify an individual. Anyone want to volunteer a couple of examples? Anybody at all? Give you a moment to perhaps think what kind of information identifies an individual. So a national insurance number, absolutely, yes, absolutely can identify an individual. Name and address, yes, they're probably the most common ones. Yeah, your spouse's name might, absolutely. Date of birth definitely can. Yeah, so these are all really good examples of personal data. And so this is data that we should be looking after. That's fantastic, brilliant, thanks everybody. So this is what we mean when we talk about data. So let's get rid of the poll results. Okay, so this is what we mean about data when we're talking generally about data protection. So let's move on to the ICO advice. That's the Information Commissioner's advice. So the ICO published a blog, like I said earlier on, back in March, and the link at the bottom of that slide is the link to the blog. So they say there are 6 things that you should be doing. You should be keeping it clear. This is one of the fundamental principles of GDPR, believe it or not. Keeping it clear. You should be clear, open and honest with people about what you're doing with their personal information. You need to tell them why you need it, what you'll do with it, and who you're going to share it with. It's best to have it written down in a document called a privacy notice, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about privacy notices shortly. But if it's going to delay vital support, creating a privacy notice, then you can just go right ahead and speak to people. But you should come back to your privacy notice when you do have time. Keep sharing. So lots of people think that data protection means that you have to guard data with your life. It doesn't mean that. In an emergency, working with partners and sharing information with them can make a real difference to public safety. In fact, it could be more harmful not to share data than to share it. For example, you might need to tell a local council about somebody you are worried about because they are housebound due to self-isolation or for some other reason. Does anybody have any particular examples within their communities where they have felt that they should be sharing information? Do put it in the chat box while we go. So if you can, think ahead. What kind of information are you likely to share? What do you need to do to make sure that that happens securely? So when we share information, we should be thinking about the information that we share. Why are we sharing it? How are we sharing it? and what happens with that data once we've shared it. So if we're sharing it with a local council, chances are that they've got really good information processes in place. So we can be fairly certain that they will deal with that information properly. If we're sharing information with another organisation, do we know those same things? So we need to think about what might happen with that information afterwards. And we need to think about the consequences of sharing that information on the person who the information is about. So what happens if that information gets leaked? What's the consequences to them? But data protection law does not prevent us from sharing personal information where it is appropriate and important to do so. So keeping it lawful, it always seems quite amusing to me in some ways that part of the law says you need to be lawful. But what this means is in GDPR, there are 6 lawful purposes for processing and using information. I'm not going to go into those 6 processes today. That's a much longer course, to be honest. And if you're from an organisation that established not just for COVID-19 response, then you need to consider your data protection requirements on a longer term basis. And here at Spark, we can assist you with that. So if you need to go into the details of those 6 lawful purposes, then do come back to us at Spark for some assistance. But generally, if you're not sure whether you should be handling personal data, think about whether it falls into one of the following categories. Would the person expect me to use their information in this way? Have they given me their clear and unambiguous consent to use their personal information? Is the person's health or safety at risk if I don't use their personal data? If you can say yes to any of those 3 questions, then you can handle and share personal information. You should always take particular care if you're handling sensitive data, which we've already talked about. Can you raise your hand if you're using sensitive data at the moment? Can you raise your hand? Yeah, there's some hands going up. So there's definitely people using sensitive data. Brilliant, thank you. So if you're using sensitive data, you should ask some further questions because sensitive data needs to be looked after a bit more carefully than personal information. So the 3 questions for that are, do I need this information to protect a person at risk? Have they given me their explicit consent to use their private information? Would this information save someone's life? So again, if you can answer yes to any of those questions, then you can also handle and share this type of information. And do make sure that you're doing only what's necessary and appropriate for the task at hand. Keeping it secure. So you must look after personal data that you collect. That means keeping it secure on a device or in a locked cabinet, for example. If it's on a device, it can be your own device, but it needs to be kept securely. So if you're keeping it on a smartphone, for example, or a laptop, you at the very least need to be thinking about password protection. But security measures don't need to be so onerous that they prevent you from carrying out the work that you're doing. So I often hear people worrying about how much security they need to put in place. The law expects you to be reasonable. So what's reasonable for a really large company is not reasonable for a small community group. That doesn't mean that you should do nothing, but you should be doing things that definitely keep things secure, but reasonable in the context of the size of your group and what you can afford to do. So reasonable is one of those words in law that is difficult to pin down necessarily, but it does allow things to be flexible. So this is where you should be thinking about the impact on a vulnerable person if the information they have entrusted you with becomes lost or stolen. So for example, you're keeping information about your neighbours or your street or your local area on your smartphone and you lose your smartphone and somebody else could get into your smartphone to get that information, what could be the impact on those vulnerable people? So, and applying measures to reasonably reduce the risk of all of those things happening. So reducing the risk of somebody being able to open your smartphone without you being there, reduce the risks of you losing your smartphone. If you find a foolproof method for that, do let me know. I'm quite good at losing things. And things like using the BCC on emails, if you're using emails. So BCC, that's blind carbon copy rather than just CCing. If you're forwarding on emails, removing people's information from the header of the email, those kinds of things. And again, the ICO have produced some really good tips on keeping data secure. So that's the handout that I'm going to email you after the webinar. Okay, hopefully you're all keeping up and nobody's fast asleep just yet. So keeping it to a minimum. You should only use and keep what you need to provide help to vulnerable people during the crisis. When this emergency is over, if that's the reason why your organisation exists, you should make sure that you and your volunteers securely delete or destroy any personal information that you no longer need. And that generally applies to all personal information. Once you no longer need it, you should securely delete or destroy it. So the law wants people to only keep information that they need. And then keeping a record of what you've done. So finally, in terms of the ICO advice, they want you to keep a record of any decisions that you make involving the use of personal information. Ideally, you set up how you would record that before you start collecting information. But the ICO understands that, again, things are a little bit different at the moment. People have to make decisions quickly. So they recommend that you make sure you keep notes of what you've done and why, and then make more detailed records as soon as you can. Okay, so hopefully that's fairly easy to understand. Like I say, that's all on a blog, and that link is there on that slide, and you will get these slides after this. So we've had a number of groups ask us if they should register with the ICO. So generally, organisations, businesses, and so on that use personal information have to register with the ICO and pay a fee. However, as a community group and a not-for-profit organisation, you are very likely to not be required to register or pay a fee. However, it's still important that you follow data protection guidance when handling people's information. How do you know if you're not a not-for-profit organisation that qualifies for an exemption? Sorry, that's my phone ringing in the background. Do apologise about that. If your organisation was established for not-for-profit making purposes and doesn't make a profit, then you are exempt. You can also make a profit as long as you're only making a profit for the organisation's purposes. So as long as the profit is not used to enrich other people, then you are exempt. But in these terms, there are some things that the ICO say that you should do with the information. You should be only processing information that's necessary to establish or maintain membership or support. You should only be processing information necessary to provide or administer activities for people who are members of the organisation or have regular contact with it. So if you're a COVID-19 group, the people that you are regularly helping out fall into that category. You should only hold information about individuals whose data you need to process for your exempt purpose, and so that's whatever reason you establish for. Yeah, so hopefully that's clear. If that's clear as mud, do let me know and we can talk about that offline. Like I say, here at Spark, we're quite used to helping people through some of the more complicated bits of data protection. So let's very quickly talk about privacy notices, and then after that I'm going to open it up to any questions. So privacy notices. How should I tell people about how we're processing personal data during the pandemic? Well, the ICO and the law ask you to have a privacy notice for people. It should be clear and accessible, ideally in place before you start using people's information. Again, the ICO recognise that right now that's not always possible. But they do say that these are some of the things that you should think about including on a privacy notice. It's not limited to these things. There is a template, and a link to that template is also on this slide. So you need to be, people need to be able to contact you. So that's why the organisation's name and contact details should be on there. You should be telling people why you're gathering their data and what kind of data and how you got hold of it, how long you're going to hold it for, and then how people can request it be erased. All those things are in the template, and the template is a bit longer as well, and possibly contains a couple of things that you might find confusing. So it talks about lawful purposes. So if you need help completing that template, do let us know. So hopefully that covers, or like I say, you'll get these in the slides so you can refer back to these really easily. So hopefully that covers all the things about a privacy notice that you need to know immediately. So this has been a really quick hop and a skip through data protection. I'm absolutely aware that it doesn't cover everything. Has anybody got any questions? If you prefer to ask your questions, if you want to verbally, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you. So if you want to ask a question, anybody got any questions? It's all very quiet. Okay, so do feel free to ask questions offline if you would prefer to. Oh, here we go. So do we need to consider retaining data to protect ourselves from future legal action? That's a very good question. That's quite a complicated question, I think. It rather depends on what it is that you've been doing. If you might consider holding on to a list of people's names so that you can tell who you supported, and you might consider holding on to the list of activities that you did with them and the support that you gave them for a period of time after you've done that for them, but you wouldn't want to hold that indefinitely. If you're concerned because you've referred somebody because of a safeguarding concern, then absolutely you should hold on to that data for a while. If you've got a specific scenario in mind, do come and talk to us, because that might be more complicated. Generally, there shouldn't be a reason to hold on to people's data indefinitely. Like I say, if you have a specific scenario where you think that somebody might have some reason to come back to you, then that might be different. And that would be one of the circumstances where you would record your decision around that personal data. So you would be really clear about, we're keeping hold of this person's personal data for these reasons, we're going to keep hold of it for this length of time, and then we'll come back and revisit that decision at that point. Hopefully that makes sense. Like I say, do come back to me if you want further clarification around that. Okay, cool. Are there any other questions? Let me just see if there are any floating in the Q&A box. No. Okay, cool. All right. I don't see any other questions. So Spark's contact details, if you don't have them already, will be on the slides, so you can get hold of us at any point. Like I say, we are used to dealing with lots of data protection questions for community groups, charities and local organisations, so do get in touch with us. Thank you ever so much for participating in today's webinar. I've managed to keep it to the half an hour as promised, which is a small miracle. Thank you ever so much. I hope you found it useful, and do contact us offline if you have any questions around GDPR and data protection. Thanks ever so much and have a great day. Bye.